move to slide 3, on which you can see an overview of this webinar. And we'll start with a short introduction, and then we'll move to the public background session to provide information on the following consultation documents: issues paper on insurer culture and application paper on supervisory colleges. And after that, we will move to the public discussion session to present 2 papers which were adopted last week: application paper on supervision of control functions and application paper on resolution powers and planning. So now we'll start with a short introduction. So the Iais is an international standard setting body responsible for developing and assisting in the implementation of material related to insurance supervision. And the Iais develops 2 categories of material: supervisor material and supporting material. And there are 2 types of supervisor material. The first is insurance core principles, which apply to supervision of insurance legal entities and, unless otherwise specified, to insurance groups. And the second type is CONFRAME, which provides standards focusing on effective group-wide supervision of internationally active insurance groups, known as IAIGs. Supporting material help with practical implementation application of supervisor material, and there are 2 types of supporting material. The first one is issues papers, which provide the background on particular topics, describe current practices, examples, or case studies. They identify relevant issues and challenges, and those papers do not create expectations on how supervisors should implement supervisor material. And application papers provide further advice, illustrations, recommendations, or examples of good supervisory practices on how ICPs and CONFRAME material should be implemented or may be implemented. It is worth to highlight that supporting material does not provide new requirements, and we would also like to mention the principle of proportionality, which underlines all ICPs and CONFRAME. And we acknowledge that insurers come in different shapes and size, and how they are supervised might need to reflect that. And the application papers often provide examples of how proportionality principle could work in practice. And now we will start with the first proper part of the webinar, which is a public background session on insurance, on issues paper on insurer culture. And I will hand over to Emma Curtis, Chair of the Market Conduct Working Group, and Anna Jernova, Chair of the Governance Working Group.
Thanks very much, Grzegorz, and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining the session today. It's great to have everybody here. So I'm the Chair of the Market Conduct Working Group in the IAIS, and this part of the presentation today will focus on the issues paper on insurer culture. So this paper is being developed jointly by the Market Conduct Working Group and the Governance Working Groups. And you might remember that this project was presented to stakeholders in a public session in February this year. And since that time, we've finalised the draft paper for public consultation, and today we would like to present the consultation draft to you. So if we move to the next slide, as you can see on this slide, the draft issues paper was released for a 2-month public consultation on the 23rd of June this year. And public consultation comments are due back to the IAIS by Monday, the 23rd of August, 2021. So the consultation document and further details are available on the public consultation page of the IAIS website, and the link is provided on this slide. So in terms of the next steps, the paper is scheduled for adoption in November this year. And after that, we'll hold another public discussion session to present the final paper and to resolve public consultation comments and any potential follow-up work that comes out of the paper. So just by way of background, conduct and culture were identified in the IAIS strategic plan as one of the key trends in insurance markets and insurance supervision in coming years. So issues related to conduct and culture are becoming increasingly important to both conduct and prudential supervisors. This is particularly in light of rapidly changing financial markets driven by innovation, as well as shifts in consumer expectations and also broader societal challenges. And we've also seen it emerge as an important theme during the current COVID-19 crisis. So all of this calls for a more integrated approach to assessing prudential and conduct risks, as it's recognised that conduct risks can lead to considerable financial soundness concerns for the sector, and also vice versa. So given the importance of this topic, the market conduct and the governance working groups were tasked with developing this paper. We acknowledge that issues relating to culture are complex and wide-ranging in nature, and that's why we've adopted a sequential approach to address this really important topic. So the first phase will involve IAIS developing this issues paper, with the scope limited to exploratory observations on the importance of insurer culture and how key components of culture can influence the achievement of prudential and conduct outcomes. And then in the second phase, we'll consider how to advance these observations through further engagement and potentially more targeted exploration of some specific cultural drivers, or potentially some practical supervisory guidance on those drivers. So the next slide talks about how IAIS understands culture. So, and this is within the context of insurers specifically. So you can see the definition here from the IAIS glossary and the most relevant ICP standards, which were taken as a starting point when we drafted the paper. In the paper, we recognise that corporate culture is composed of at least two layers. One is the visible and working on a conscious or surface level, and then the other one is on a more deeper or subliminal level. And it's worth recognising also that embedding culture across an insurer goes deeper than just the tone that's set at the top by the board and the senior management. It's important to understand how the tone is practically filtered down through middle management and below to the staff level. And it potentially also includes agents and intermediaries of the firm. So we do agree that agents and intermediaries are an important part of the cultural makeup of the insurer's business. But as a first step in the paper, we're focusing primarily on cultural elements relating directly to internal staff within insurers. But as we mentioned in the paper, the relevant elements of ICP 19 are applicable to, which are applicable to insurers, will also apply to intermediaries. So I'll hand over to Anna now, who will talk more about the objective, focus and structure of the issues paper. Over to you, Anna.
Thank you, Emma. Just checking you can hear me okay?
We can, thanks, Anna.
We can hear you.
Okay, fantastic. And apologies, we're having slight technical difficulties earlier. So thank you. My name is Anna Genova. I am the chair of the Governance Working Group, and I'll talk briefly about the issues paper itself. So on slide 10, you'll see that this paper aims to explore the concept of insurer culture as a key intersection point for managing prudential and conduct risks. It also investigates the role of culture in mitigating misconduct and recognizes that widespread misconduct may be the result of deeper organizational deficiencies, which are caused by an ineffective culture. The paper highlights that insurer culture helps provide the supervisor with important insights into the driving forces behind decisions and practices within the insurer. This can facilitate more timely and effective identification of both prudential and conduct concerns. In order to make the paper practical, we've included examples and case studies to show how selected cultural drivers can result in both positive and negative prudential and conduct outcomes. And on this slide, you can see a figure, which we've also included in the paper. And this figure is aimed at presenting the main interconnections in a simplified manner and should hopefully be helpful in grasping the main concepts described in the issues paper. However, given the complexity of this topic, naturally this graph is not aimed at presenting all interlinks in an exhaustive manner, but is intentionally a high-level summary of these. Now, moving on to the slide setting out the structure of the issues paper, you will see that we've already covered the content of sections 1 and 2 in the previous slide. So I'll focus purely on section 3 here. So as already mentioned, the paper describes how cultural drivers can influence certain prudential and conduct outcomes within an insurer. For exploratory purposes, the scope of this paper is limited to these selected factors due to their important role in informing decisions and behaviors in basically every aspect of an insurer's business and their correlations with the expectations set out in the ICPs. In this context, it is beneficial for both supervisors and insurers to understand how those organizational elements can influence an insurance culture and reinforcing behaviors and practices that either increase or decrease the risk of occurrence or widespread misconduct. And on this slide, you can see the list of cultural drivers which are described in more detail in the paper. And these are the insurer's values, business objectives and strategies, leadership accountability, communication within the insurer, and internal remuneration and performance management structures. The last, before we move on to the questions, we'll just do a quick recap of the process going forward. So as mentioned by Emma at the beginning of the presentation, the draft issues paper is currently open for a 2-month public consultation, and we welcome comments by the 23rd of August. We encourage you to provide your feedback on the draft paper, which will certainly be very useful in finalising the draft for final adoption. Your comments will also be helpful as we consider what areas relating to culture the Iais should prioritise as potential follow-up work to the paper. And following resolution of public consultation comments, the paper is scheduled for adoption in November this year. At that time, we will present the outcomes of the public consultation, and we should also be able to communicate the next steps in terms of possible follow-up work. So Emma, I'll hand back to you to take up any questions we may have.
Thanks very much, Anna. So now we would like to open up the floor for questions. So if you can please use the Q&A function to type your question, or if you'd like to ask verbally, you can use the raise hand function to request to be unmuted.
So, Emma, I think we've got a question from David Snyder.
Please go ahead. Is it a verbal question?
Yeah, seems to be. He's got his hand raised.
Would you like to go ahead?
Me? Hello, yes. Can you hear me?
And thanks, David.
Thank you very much. On behalf of JIFIA and APCIA, thank you for this session. 2 questions, really general questions, and then a more specific question. There was a discussion about future engagement with stakeholders, and I know that we would be interested in engagement in addition to any formal consultation process, and believe that particularly in an area like this would be very helpful. So we're ready and available anytime there can be any sort of dialogue, roundtable, or other consultation with regard to this paper or any next steps. Second general comment question is, are there particular elements of this paper that you're looking for stakeholder and specifically industry input? And finally, sort of a general concern about the subjectivity of the whole issue. And I know that we're all trying to figure out how to move forward with a general concept. And I guess the question is, if full compliance with the ICPs and legislated and regulatory standards is achieved by the company, why is culture relevant beyond that sort of compliance with existing standards? So a couple process questions, and then the that other more substantive question. And again, thank you very much for the work on this, and we very much look forward to working with you in the future as we have in the past.
Thanks very much, David, for those comments and questions. In relation to the first one about engagement and a possible roundtable, I guess my immediate response to that is that we're now in a remote environment, which makes those sorts of interactions a little bit more challenging. But I might see if Fazana or Grzegorz has any comment to that from a secretariat perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Emma. So I'll maybe start, and then Grzegorz can come in. So thanks very much David, and I think particularly on the process issues, which are linked to the substantive issues. You know, this is a very complex area, and we know that there's a lot of substantive and subjective views on it. And I think we would also welcome more robust engagement going forward. In terms of setting up an actual roundtable or further targeted engagement session, I think what we want to do is go through the public consultation process first. And to answer your question on particular areas you should focus on, we particularly are interested in areas that you think we should be elaborating on in the future. And I think based on that, we can have a discussion in terms of more targeted roundtables on specific issues that we maybe want to elaborate or explore further from a practical perspective in terms of future work. But I'll pause there and just check if Grzegorz has anything additional that he'd like to add.
Thank you, Farzana. Nothing specific to add, maybe just to say that as indicated on the slide, we are planning another interaction with stakeholders in November, and during this session we will discuss the final paper, but also the next steps, and going beyond and moving to the next year. We have not planned any specific activities yet, but we would envisage that there will be another touch points, and we would organize another possibilities to have interaction and discussions with stakeholders on this potential follow-up work.
Thanks, Farzana and Grzegorz. So hopefully, David, that answers your first question about engagement. And I think Farzana also addressed the second question about where input would be desirable. And I think I'd add to that by saying any sort of feedback that you think is valuable and appropriate on the paper would be very welcome. We're very keen to hear different perspectives and inputs. And then before I hand to Anna to see if she has any comments as well in response, in relation to your final point about subjectivity and what this means, I guess, for supervisors and for firms, it's a very good question that you pose. I think what we're trying to do is almost identify a way of measuring culture almost as an early warning system, as a flag for both supervisors and for firms, for boards and executives to identify when there may be issues, latent issues within the firm that may lead to conduct issues and or prudential issues. And so that sort of links to the list of cultural drivers that Anna mentioned. But yes, it is a tricky question, and one that we are very interested to explore and to hear people's thoughts on that and where we could perhaps take the work in future. But I'll pause there and see if Anna wants to add anything to your questions in response.
Sure, thanks, Emma, and thanks, David, for your question. I think the first two have been covered. I may just add something on your last question around, you know, if insurers are achieving full compliance with ICPs, why is culture relevant? So I think there is always a risk, the fact that compliance with ICPs can be achieved, I guess, on paper at a high level. But what we've seen in practice as regulators and supervisors, and I think generally, is that quite often culture can be something that is underlying, that can take, at the end of the day, can be one of the drivers of why things go wrong in a firm. And you know, while initially on paper things may look good, a toxic culture is one that can then lead to quite negative and potentially disastrous consequences in some cases. And so looking at culture and sort of something that I think historically many have found quite difficult to measure or to assess, or is something that we've tried to look into. And we're not trying to prescribe a particular that this is what a good culture is. And I think that kind of goes to your point of the subjectivity. But as Emma notes, that what we've tried to highlight is some of the potential red flags, because at the end of the day, when something does go wrong with in an institution, everybody can sort of tell, oh, you can see when you have a bad culture, you know it, but it can be quite hard to describe. And this is one of the things that we've tried to, so something we've tried to do with the red flags, because again, getting culture wrong can have effects further down the line.
Thanks, Anna. Now, I saw some other questions coming from Bernie Birnbaum, but I can't seem to access them.
It's fine. Can I just read them out to you, Emma?
Yep.
So it's 3 questions, and I think I just preface this by saying some of them they're pretty substantive, and I think are addressed in the paper itself. And you know, we probably would really appreciate these comments in the actual public, in the written comments, so that we can respond in more detail. But I'll just highlight, and maybe you and Anna can do a very high-level response. So the first question from Bernie is, does the IAIS consider culture and conduct to be the same? If not, what are the differences? Maybe should I pause there, or do you want me to ask you the other 2 questions?
Why don't we address them as we go? So, Anna, do you want to have a go at that one first?
Sure, I was happy to. So I think it's fair to say that we don't, they're not the same, but we do see them as interlinked. And I think this is, I know we had a diagram earlier up on the slide deck in terms of what it is that kind of what we see as some of the drivers of culture, and some of the relationships between culture and conduct. I think one of the elements is that when people think of conduct, it can be potentially through a relatively narrow lens. And what we're trying to signal is the fact that elements of culture and how particular issues are approached can be wider than that. I don't know, Emma, if there's anything that you wanted to kind of to add on this as well from your work?
I guess I was just going to be a bit simplistic and say it's almost as though culture is the why and conduct is the what. So conduct is what you see. It's the behaviour which can lead to consumer outcomes and prudential, consequently to prudential outcomes. And culture, I suppose, is some of the drivers underlying those outcomes, which is why it's interesting to unpack some of those drivers. Farzana, do you want to continue with the next question?
Yeah. So the next question, I think also maybe points to some potential future work that we want to look to. And the question from Bernie again is there any empirical evidence that a particular culture is associated with good consumer outcomes? So I'm going to ask the third question also, because I think it's linked. So the next question is, the draft issues paper starts by describing how conduct risk can lead to prudential risk. Why is culture identified as the point of intersection between prudential and conduct risk, as opposed to an assessment of actual consumer market outcomes?
Thanks, Farzana, and yeah, great questions. So I suppose to the first one, I'm not sure that we're at a stage to be able to identify what an ideal culture is, but I would imagine it would be one which is consumer centric and does try and put the consumer at the heart of the business model, and to have a feedback loop looking at metrics that measure outcomes, consumer outcomes, and really learns from those outcomes and kind of builds them back into the business model. But I'm not sure that we're ready to nail that issue particularly, as in this is an exploratory piece and it could lead on to some further work in some of these areas. And then to the second question, I don't know, Anna, do you want to have a go at the second question? Anna, I'm not sure if, We can't hear you if you're talking, Anna.
So Emma, maybe we can move on to the next question, and if Anna gets back, then maybe we can hand back over to her.
You. Anna, we can't quite hear you. Yeah, Anna, we can't hear you very well. I can hear you talking, but I can't make out the words.
Yes,
Sorry,
Sorana, the sound is of very poor quality. Like as Emma said, we can hear that you are speaking, but we cannot understand what you are saying.
So I think Anna she is on the chat, so maybe if she can type her response on the chat, that might be helpful also, while we move on to the next question.
Thanks, Fazana.
So I think moving on, and I think this is also kind of, it's a really good question, because I think it already signals to some of the future work that we'd like to do from a practical perspective. So we've got a question here from Chandri, who asks, is a specific measurement going to be recommended for culture?
Thank you, Chandri. So that's a great question, and it is something that we've been pondering, and it leads into some possible future work and some anticipated work that we've started scoping around measuring outcomes or metrics for consumer outcomes. I don't think that we would end up with one measurement, but there may be a range of measures that could be utilised. And as part of that work, we've started to do some scoping to understand what different supervisors are currently using to measure outcomes, which can be an indicia of culture, of a healthy culture or a problematic culture. So we are very interested in that work, and I think it does lead on quite naturally from this paper. And it would be really helpful if, when people are giving feedback, if they could indicate where they think value could be extracted from future work in that area. And yeah, any feedback on that issue would be most welcome.
So Emma, if I can add to that, because I think it links to the earlier question, I think that Bernie also asked around, do we have empirical evidence around the link between culture and specific consumer outcomes? I think one of the other things that would be really great if we got from stakeholders are their own examples. So similar to the examples that we've used in the paper, if they've got examples that they can think of where particular types of culture or particular types of cultural drivers that they've seen lead to specific aspects. And I think, again, here, I just want to emphasize a lot of these questions have been conduct specific, but the intention of the paper is to look at culture from both the lens of conduct and prudential outcomes. So that would also be very helpful.
Thanks, Fazana. I might just see if Anna's joined us again. So I can see Bernie's asked a further question about whether the Market Conduct Working Group's work on key performance indicators for conduct has informed the issues paper on culture. In short, it's really the other way around. So the culture work has been done first, and then our next piece of work is planned to be on key performance indicators. And so we're very much using the work that we've done on culture to help map out the work in relation to key performance indicators. So watch this space for further work on that issue, that very important issue, with a clear link to culture. Any other questions?
I think we have 2 minutes left. We can maybe take one more question before we move on.
We have one question via verbal. Can I mute the
Lazaro?
participant? Mhm.
Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you.
Hello, thank you. Thank you very much for the paper. It's really, really interesting. I would like to ask your opinion about the role of market culture, because of course insurer culture is very much depending on the market culture and the expectation from the supervisors and also for consumers may really influence the insurer culture, depending very much on the national market or the line of business.
Thank you for that question. Yes, I agree. That's definitely relevant. And I think, so one of the things that I referred to earlier on was that there's more, I guess, consumer expectations are increasing, and so that's helped to drive this work in part. And I think that's a reflection of broader market movements with more informed consumers with higher expectations of their product providers. And clearly, yes, in different markets, there'll be very specific different environments and cultures operating both in the distribution channels as well as the supply channels and the broader investment markets that will influence insurers. So yeah, those things clearly do need to be considered and will have a definite influence. So again, we'd be very interested to hear people's thoughts on that and whether that's been reflected in the paper or whether people have additional feedback on that issue.
Thanks, Emma, and thanks to everyone for the questions. I think we really look forward to some of these substantive and very valuable comments through the written public consultation process. I think we're now ready to move on to the next section. So I'll hand over to Grzegorz and Rob.
Thank you very much. Yes, indeed. So we are moving to the next part about the application paper on supervisory colleges, which will be presented by Rob Curtis, chair of the Insurance Group's working group.
Thanks, Grzegorz, and welcome everyone. My name is Rob Curtis, and I am the chair of the Insurance Group working group. And this part of the webinar is focused on the draft revised application paper on supervisory colleges. So just to bring you some information on the process, the draft revised application paper was released for public consultation on the 23rd of June. The public consultation will last 2 months. Comments are due by Tuesday, the 24th of August this year, of course. The consultation document and further details are available on the public consultation page of the Iais website under the link provided on the slide. We expect the final version of the paper to be adopted in November this year. And after the adoption, we will hold a public discussion session to present the final paper and the outcome of the public consultation itself. So in terms of some background material for you, the application paper on supervisory colleges was originally adopted actually back in 2014 by the Iais. And given all relevant developments that took place since then, including revision of relevant ICPs and adoption of ComFrame in 2019, the paper became effectively out of date. So in this context, the objective of the revision was really to reflect the revised ICPs, and in particular ICP 3 and ICP 25, as well as the ComFrame material. So the organisation of supervisory colleges and supervisory cooperation within colleges is also evolving, as we know, and therefore we wanted to make sure that the paper reflects up-to-date supervisory practices. Now, due to the volume of changes, the revised paper is presented only in a clean version. So if we go on to look at the what the context of the original paper had, it included a lot of details about internal aspects of supervisory cooperation. And as part of the revision, we've taken the opportunity to streamline and focus on processes and practices related to the establishment and functioning of supervisory colleges, most relevant from the stakeholder perspective. At the same time, more granular aspects of supervisory cooperation within colleges, effectively not really relevant from an industry perspective, have been moved to an implementation guide, which will be available only to supervisors, being the Iais members. So with this updated and streamlined application paper, we aim to foster an understanding of activities of supervisory colleges, as well as explaining the role and involvement of insurers in the work of supervisory colleges themselves. So in terms of the next slide, the structure and content of the application paper itself. On this slide, you'll see the structure of the draft revised application paper as it's presented. As you can see, the paper covers a broad range of issues. Section 1 is a simple introduction. Section 2 describes the process of establishing a supervisory college and possible approaches to the structure and membership of colleges themselves. Section 3 focuses on coordination arrangements, which are used to establish a framework for supervisory college operations, as well as exchange information. In this regard, we pay particular attention to protecting confidential information shared within supervisory colleges. In Section 4, we highlight that a supervisory college is a permanent platform for supervisory cooperation and coordination. This section also describes a planning cycle for the supervisory college activities, including development of supervisory college work plans, as well as activities related to the group-wide risk assessment. The paper highlights that discussing issues related to the group-wide risk assessment in a supervisory college aims at establishing a common understanding of the risks to which the group, its legal entities, and branches are exposed. The paper also encourages exchanging different views and perspectives within the supervisory college itself. Now, Section 5 covers various aspects related to organisation of the supervisory college meetings. The subsection on involvement of group-wide senior management in supervisory college meetings may be particularly helpful to the insurance industry representatives on the call today. This section also describes possible follow-up actions such as feedback letters from the group-wide supervisor to the insurance group. Now, that's basically an overview of the paper. In terms of the next slide, going forward to recap the process. On this slide, you'll see we have provided basically a recap of what this looks like going forward. As I mentioned at the beginning, comments on the draft application paper are due by 24 August. We encourage you to provide comments on the draft paper, which clearly will help in finalising the paper itself. We expect that the paper will be adopted in November this year. So with that, I'm very happy to take questions on the draft revised paper. Please use the chat function to type your question, or alternatively, if you want to ask a question verbally, please use the raise hand function to be unmuted.
So as for now, it seems we do not have any questions, but let's wait a bit more to let participants either raise their virtual hand or to type the question using the chat. It seems we do not have any questions. So thank you very much, Rob. And I just want to encourage all attendees to provide your feedback on the paper during the public consultation period. And with this, we will move to the next part of this webinar, which will be on the application paper on supervision of control functions. And now I will hand over again to Anna Jernova in her capacity of the chair of the governance working group.
Thank you, Gregor. Just checking if you can hear me this time.
Thank you very much. I can hear you.
Okay, good. And apologies for the technical issues. I've moved outside to try and not rely on Wi-Fi. So apologies for any background noise that you will get. So now we will move on to the next part of this event, which is the public discussion session on the application paper on the supervision of control functions, which was developed by the governance working group. So the draft of this paper was released for public consultation earlier in the year, and the final version was adopted by the executive committee last week. So on this slide, you can see some background information related to this project. Regarding the rationale for why we looked into control functions, well, the Iais recognized that effective control functions with the necessary independence, stature, and resources are a crucial element of the effective system of risk management and internal controls. Work performed by control functions can also be useful for supervisors. On the other hand, though, ineffective control functions may weaken an insurer and require increased supervisory intention. So in this context, the objective of this paper is to describe the practices related to supervision of control functions as described in relevant Iais supervisory material. Now, regarding this input, this paper is mainly based on results of a survey among Iais members, and we also took into consideration the outcome of the peer review of corporate and risk governance from 2020, as well as feedback received from stakeholders during consultation, which was very helpful in finalizing the paper, and thank you to all of those who submitted comments. So looking at the structure and the content of the application paper, you will see that the structure in particular has not changed as compared to the consultation draft. Now, I won't elaborate on this in detail, as expected. A number of you may have been on the call during the consultation phase, during the stakeholder session, but I would just like to highlight that the paper covers a number of issues applicable to various control functions, including their role, their independence, stature, combination of control functions, and also the outsourcing of control functions. In addition, there is a separate section focused on the internal audit function, and this is because we identified a number of specific challenges related to the supervision of the internal audit function, and so we decided that it would be helpful to address these in a separate standalone section. Most of the challenges described in this application paper apply to both insurance legal entities and insurance groups. But in addition, in Section 8, we covered issues that are specific to the supervision of group-wide control functions. Now, looking at the next slide on the outcome of the public consultation, which, as I mentioned, took place earlier this year. So we received comments from 15 participants, which in total added up to 350 comments. So thank you very much for those. It kept us very busy. We took on board a lot of these comments and have provided some additional explanation as part of the resolution to the comments. The links to the application paper as adopted last week and the table with public comments and how these were resolved are provided on the slide. You have those there if you want to have a look at those. You'll be pleased to hear that I will not go through each of the 350 comments, but we will highlight some of the general comments and other key points received. So on this slide, we've outlined some of the overarching comments. And regarding comments on the principle of proportionality, which is the first one we wanted to touch on, we would like to confirm that proportionality applies to the content of the application paper. We have highlighted this in the general description on page 2 of the paper to reinforce that message. The proportionality principle is also explained in the introduction, and you can find in the paper examples of applying this principle in practice. We've also stated on page 2 of the paper that the application papers do not include new requirements, which was a comment that we had from a few respondents. And this paper has also been reviewed to ensure that it does not give the impression of introducing new requirements. So hopefully that helps address some of the potential concerns. In this regard, we have a revised description of some supervisory practices to make the language more balanced. We would also like to highlight that in general, the paper offers a number of good supervisory practices. However, supervisors should apply described practices as needed and relevant, and in consideration of all relevant circumstances. So now I'd just like to talk a bit about some of the main issues raised in comments and how we've looked to address these. And so we'll talk about that on this slide and the next one. So first, there were a lot of comments on the 3 lines model, and we have updated our reference to this model in light of the comments received. We also included an explanation of the internal control system as described in the ICPs, and we clarified that while there are similarities between this model and the ICP standards on supervision of the internal control system, the 3 lines model is not required in ICP. There was also a valid point raised in comments that control functions should have a seat at the table in relevant business discussions, including initial discussions. In this way, control functions can provide input early into the process, which facilitates effective and efficient cooperation. So we have reflected this in the language in paragraph 14. There were also comments that the focus should be on cooperation, collaboration, and communication instead of segregation of responsibilities, which is something we focused on in the paper. So in this regard, what we have done is we've replaced references to segregation of responsibilities with allocation of responsibilities, again to use more balanced language. And we have also highlighted in several places in the paper about the importance of cooperation and communication to ensure that, again, this is also picked up. However, in the Iais' view, a clear allocation of responsibilities is also important in ensuring effective collaboration within the insurer. So we have kept references to that. Moving on to the second slide of the main issues raised. Based on the comments received, we reflected materiality aspects in the context of outsourcing. As a consequence, the paper refers to material activities and functions in this context. In the context of combining responsibilities of control functions and senior management, a number of commentators stated that in certain corporate governance structures, key person in control functions may be considered as part of senior management. So we have reflected that in subsection 6.3, highlighting at the same time that in such a situation, the senior management role would typically involve only control responsibilities. In addition, regardless of the organizational structure, certain conditions should be met when combining a key person in control function and a senior management role. And in section 8, in response to feedback received, we included additional explanation about the position of insurance legal entities within the group. And this has been done in some cases by referring to our previous work, including the application paper on group-wide corporate governance. Moving on to the next slide on examples of textual changes based on the comments received. So we have also made a number of other specific changes across the paper. So you can see examples of such changes referring to time-limited restrictions when taking over as a key person in control function in certain circumstances, variable remuneration, and the staffing of control functions. And on the bottom of this slide, we have also listed other paragraphs in which some textual changes have been made based on the comments received. In addition, we made some changes across the paper to clarify the language for consistency. So that is all that I wanted to highlight from our side. I would once again like to thank you for all of the valuable feedback. It has been very helpful to get that additional perspective. And so now I will open the floor to questions. And as in the earlier instances, please use the chat function to type your question. And you can also ask your question verbally. In this case, please use the raise hand function and you will be unmuted. And Gregor, I would appreciate your help on spotting any of those, just in case I cannot see this.
Thank you. So we have one question from David Snyder. So Anya, if I could ask you to unmute David so he can ask his question verbally.
David, you have the floor now, please.
Yes. Thank you, Anna, and the entire corporate governance working group. I do think that our comments were seriously considered, and we fully support a number of the changes that were made in the paper. So I think the process worked very, very well here. So I want to thank you for that. I guess my question is going forward, if you can share, if you will, beyond the culture work, which we've just discussed, other elements of corporate governance that you think the working group will be focused on in the future, and what industry stakeholders can provide you that would be most useful. And again, thank you for the very detailed work that was done on this paper and taking our comments into consideration.
Thank you, David, and appreciate the feedback. So, Grzegorz, on the future work, because I'm conscious that a number of that was presented during the global seminar as part of the roadmap. Are you okay to highlight some of the key projects? And as mentioned, David, as you've already noted, that one of them will be taking forward the future work on the issues paper on culture and the next stages thereof. But Grzegorz, perhaps I'll pass over to you.
Yes, sure, Anna, and thank you, David, for your kind words and for recognition of our work on resolution of the comments, and thank you for your question about our future work. So now the governance working group is starting work, exploratory work on issues related to remuneration, and this will be the internal work. So at the moment, we do not plan to publish the outcome of this work. This will be more for the parent committees to determine whether there are some specific issues that would need to address, for example, by means of application papers on issues papers. As Anna mentioned, we will be busy in the second half of this year with finalizing issues paper on insurer culture together with the market conduct working group. And in this regard, we will be also considering what and if and what should be the follow-up work to focus on some of the specific aspects related to this topic. And in terms of the broader work of the Iais, the governance working group will be engaged in some of the projects carried out by our other working groups, if there is a need to do so, because these projects involved some considerations related to corporate governance. And as you might know, we are also planning to start work on diversity and inclusion, or diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this sense, the governance working group might be, for example, involved in this work. But we are also now under the discussion of what specific additional projects should be taken on by the governance working group, and this is part of the broader Iais-wide exercise of development of the next roadmap for next 2 years, 2022 and 2023, and this process should be finalized in November this year. So we would also ask you for a bit of patience, and we should be able to come back to you with some more specific plan for our future work later this year.
Thank you, Grzegorz. Are there any further questions?
It seems that we do not have any further questions, but let's wait a few seconds more to let participants either type their questions or raise their virtual hand. Okay, it doesn't seem to be the case. So thank you very much, Anna. And now we will move to the next part, which is the last part of today's event. And this will be focused on the application paper on resolution powers and planning. And this one will be presented by Alex Hart, chair of the resolution working group. So Alex, I will hand over to you now.
Thank you, Grzegorz, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all our colleagues that were kind enough to share some time with us and sign in today to hear about the new supervisory material and supporting material that the Iais has been working on. As you'll know, in the most recent parent committee meetings, EXCO approved for publication the application paper on resolution powers and planning. You all should be fairly well familiar with the paper, as many of you have seen it in various forms for consultation, both informal and formal. So for those who aren't as familiar with the paper, we'll go through a bit of background. Yeah, I think it's obvious that recovery and resolution is a broad topic that covers a lot of real estate, and it's recognition by the IAIS that with new standards that were agreed upon in November of 2019, that there was a need for some further application papers to explain a lot of the material there. And in fact, we took a lot of guidance for the application papers from questions that were received in the consultation on the ICPs and ComFrame. We chose to address recovery planning first in 2019 because that was a brand new topic that was added in ICP 16, and then the related ComFrame material. And then we next took on the resolution powers and planning part of the equation to give guidance to supervisors and resolution authorities on how to implement a resolution framework, as well as planning issues that impact the companies that may be involved. So there was also a bit of ICP and ComFrame 25 on supervisory cooperation and coordination that was included therein. But for the bulk of the paper, it addresses ICP and ComFrame 12. To begin the paper, we had input from 22 IAIS members through a survey that we circulated at the end of 2019 after the publication of the recovery planning paper. And we additionally, as I mentioned, got stakeholder feedback on the draft application paper during public consultation. Next slide, please. So just a quick overview of the application paper and what it says and what it does. There's some general information that kind of accompanies all application papers that discusses things like proportionality and its applicability throughout the paper. We go into the objectives and concepts of resolution, including policyholder protection and financial stability as top goals. We talk about entry into resolution in section 3, where we've tried to put forward guidance for some relatively concrete criteria to determine the circumstances under which resolution would be initiated. We've included some examples that are based on various jurisdictional practices, those of the working group members, as well as some additional jurisdictions that kindly contributed. Section 4 of the paper enumerates and discusses the resolution powers that the supervisor or resolution authority needs. These are all listed in ICP 12.7, and we talk about the benefits of those powers and how they should be used and what considerations may exist with their use in the application of resolution. Resolution plans are further discussed in section 5. There's some discussion around the scope of the requirement, and we've put forward again a number of examples on key elements of a resolution plan, particularly things like the resolution strategy, communication strategy, and we tried to be relatively, again, broad and encompassing in trying to establish the range of possible options that the working group was aware of. Section 6 discusses resolvability assessments and the considerations that are go into evaluating the feasibility and credibility of resolution strategies, and also suggests where to and how to resolve impediments to resolution. Section 7, the cooperation and coordination, just talks about good cooperation and coordination between the involved supervisors and/or resolution authorities. And this is both in the normal course of business as well as any crisis event. Last, we have an appendix to the paper that gives examples of resolution frameworks and powers that have been established in various IAIS member jurisdictions. Again, a lot of these were contributed by the working group members, but additional jurisdictions also gave us some very good content. So we would direct readers' attention to the appendix, where there are links to the various legislative references in the jurisdictions. Next slide, please. The last public consultation on the paper was begun in November of last year and ended in early February. We received some 250 comments from roughly 16 participants. Following addressing those comments and resolving them, the paper had the benefit of further comment by parent committee members. And at the end of the rainbow, the application paper was adopted by EXCO on June the 22nd and is now available on the IAIS website. Likewise, the resolutions to public consultation comments are available on the consultation page on the IAIS website. Next slide, please. To give you some highlights, I guess, of the more prevalent issues that came forward in the public consultation, we got a number of comments around more detail on resolution for specific business models, reinsurance being the one that we were asked to further expand upon the most often. So you will see a box in the paper that talks about considerations for the resolution of reinsurers alone. As might be expected, we also got some questions around clarifying certain terms, such as non-viability, solvent runoff, and essential services and functions, that we really want to differentiate the essential services and functions from the FSB's concept of critical services and functions, which are separately defined by the FSB, and we're not trying to make the same reference. I think there are some updates that we made to the paper to better clarify where those differentiations are and what they mean. But there's not specific detailed guidance because it's circumstantially and jurisdictionally dependent. So, you know, we've left room for supervisory and resolution authority to be able to have their judgment applied. A few technical comments and suggestions were provided, especially around the resolution powers, and we made updates accordingly throughout the paper. Next slide, please. A few more things. Talked about some certain issues that were already embedded in the ICP and ComFrame material, such as the importance of financial stability analysis, ex-ante planning, and the potential cost of ex-ante changes to improve resolvability. I would note that the paper, as is the case with all application papers, does not set forth new requirements, and we have done a consistency check with the ICP and ComFrame material to make sure that didn't happen. We did have in the consultation a suggestion for a more comprehensive list of jurisdictional examples and a further appeal to IAIS members, and did yield again some further examples in the annex. So we think that there are a good range of possible reference sources there that are there for your enlightenment. The consultation also confirmed that there's significant interest from stakeholders, both on the supervisory and industry side, in the next resolution working group project that's going to be a issues paper on the role of policyholder protection schemes in resolution. You may recall there was a paper put forward, I believe, in October of 2013 by the Market Conduct Working Group that really was kind of a principles paper, if you will, behind policyholder protection schemes. We hope that this forthcoming paper will build on the principles that were discussed in that paper and perhaps serve as a best practices guide for any jurisdiction that is looking to either revise an existing PPS or establish a PPS if one doesn't already exist. We're not trying to be comprehensive in the overview of the roles of PPS in resolution, but as I note, the focus really is on putting forward best practices. Next slide, please. And with that, that concludes my presentation. I'll open the floor to any questions you may have through the established process. And Gregor, if you can field any questions and direct them, we'll try to answer them.
Thank you, Alex. So just to remind participants can ask questions either typing them using the chat function, or you can raise your virtual hand and then you will be unmuted to ask the question. So currently we do not have any questions, but let's wait one moment.
I see there's one question from Wayne Milan. I think Anya, could you unmute him?
You have the floor now, Wayne, please.
And Wayne, you have the floor, sir.
Wayne, you are unmuted now, so okay, it seems that you are now muted, so maybe okay, now it seems you're unmuted, so you can ask your question.
Oops.
Just to check, because I think we cannot hear you, Wayne. Perhaps you can try to use chat to ask your question if the sound doesn't work.
Perhaps in the meantime, we can move to another question that just came in on the chat function. And in the meantime, we would ask Wayne perhaps to use the chat function as well. So one question just came in for you, Alex. If you could maybe tell a little bit more about the timeline for the next project on PPS. And I also see that Wayne's comment in the meantime has been included in the chat function. So we'll deal with them that one after it.
Okay. I've got a question from Alistair Campbell asking for an outline of the timeline for the Policyholder Protection Scheme issues paper. We are expecting to really just begin in earnest the planning for that paper in September. And I believe the project timeline that was approved in the roadmap for 2022 extends through to the end of the year on producing that paper. So I think we're aiming at the moment that the paper would be considered by EXCO if we're fortunate and can stay on track by the annual general meeting in November. Anna, did I misspeak or say anything I shouldn't have?
No, that's definitely correct. And perhaps to add also on the timeline, it may be good to mention that we will also inform that paper by using a survey amongst our members to see where, as Alex mentioned, a lot has changed between now and 2013. So to get a more updated insight into where we are. So that will of course take some time to develop the survey and send it out to our members. So by the end of next year, we should probably have a consultation version ready for publication.
Yeah, and I would note too that typically with any of our materials, we have tried to have kind of an interim consultation for stakeholders to review kind of the direction that we're taking and help us with any course corrections that might be necessary. And while we've again not formally laid out a timeline beyond what's in the roadmap, I would certainly anticipate that we will, at the very least, consider doing things in the same manner that we have, and that is to have an earlier informal opportunity for some further stakeholder engagement on the paper. So I see too, we have Wayne's comment that ACLI wanted to thank us for the efforts on the project, and Wayne, we thank you for the recognition. We certainly appreciate the engagement of all the stakeholders that provided various inputs, be it material or comments to the paper to help make it what it is. Are there any further questions?
Alex, I see one question coming in from Mark Radischer on the I don't know if you can see it in the chat function. It's related to the work of the FSB.
Yep, Mark is asked to elaborate on where Iais is relative to the FSB, noting that the FSB typically refers to insurance to be a bit lagging in implementation of resolution measures and regimes. It's a good question, Mark, and I would say that it's a bit unique in that resolution is the one space in insurance supervision where the FSB has taken an active role in developing supervisory material. And the FSB's work has been focused on and dedicated to the former GSI space. we are beginning to engage with FSB on a joint project to look at the key attributes relative to the ICPs and ComFrame, and see where there are similarities and any divergences. But I would say, with respect to FSB and the work that the ICBCM has been doing, there's a significant overlap in jurisdictional membership between the Iais resolution working group and the FSB's ICBCM, and there's likewise the FSB Secretariat is often a guest at the resolution working group meetings, as well as I represent IAIS as well as the United States on the FSB's ICBCM. So there's good coordination and good cooperation between the two organizations. I would say that probably, going out on a limb here, relative to the banking world, I would say that Mark, your observation is correct, that we're probably a bit behind the banking world, but I think the approval of revised ICP 12 and ComFrame 12, as well as the recovery planning materials that we added to ICP 16, I think has gone a long way towards closing that gap. But again, we continue to work hand in hand with our colleagues at the FSB, so that we try hard to complement each other's work as opposed to stepping on toes and duplicating effort. So, in a nutshell, I think we're on the right track between the two groups. Okay, any additional questions?
Thank you very much, Alex. It seems we do not have any further questions, but let's wait just a few seconds more. Okay, it seems we do not have any further questions, so thank you very much. And as all good things, also this session comes now to the end. So on behalf of the Secretariat, in particular my colleagues Hanne, Farzana, and Anya, I would like to thank all the speakers, Anna, Emma, Rob, and Alex. And I would like to thank all participants for joining us. I can see we have now over 80 attendees on the line, and thank you very much. I would like to encourage you to take part in the public consultation. And I wish you all a good day or good evening, depending on where you are. Thank you very much.